morning and welcome to another Bright News discussion. My name is Shannon Braswell and I'm here today with Craig Stewart. So without further ado, Craig, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Shannon. Thanks for inviting me to have this discussion.
Yeah, I was really, excited to have you on because I know you have a podcast yourself. Am I correct? Or
Well,
a
I don't know
couple.
if it's so much. I don't know if it's so much a podcast. I don't really do like regular interview series, although I probably should.
Mhm.
Um, but I do have some series on Gerard's work on YouTube. So I think it's three series right now. And I upload these different series and do that kind of periodically. So nothing super regular, but I do think it's nice to try to put some material together and to release those every so often anyway.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can get into that, like some of the things you talk about. I know you there's a couple series, like a couple episodes you've done on some of Rene Girard's books, like Battling to the End
Hmm.
and like an introduction to mimesis and mimetic desire and stuff like
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, just for starters, man, would you mind like telling us how you came to find Girard, how you learned about his theory?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, so there's like a quick version, and then there's like
Yeah.
a more layered version. But I think I'll just try to go
Yeah.
through it kind of quickly.
Okay.
My background, my training in my undergraduate studies was in philosophy, and I was a really aggressive student in philosophy. I really, truly and passionately wanted to figure out, like, if there was any kind of right way to approach thinking about the world. Definitely more interested in answers that could be true rather than like nothing ended up being true at all, which is where a lot of philosophical trajectories seem to end up.
Mhm.
But I went through and I kind of, I tried to really absorb the Western canon and to work things out and to see what kind of made sense. And I ended up landing in a place where it seemed like the postmodern philosophical critiques of modernity, and maybe we can like pause and get into that a little bit later on if we want to. But the postmodern critiques of modernism seem to be pretty good. They seem to be really solid critiques of modern philosophy. Um, and while I still had a real love and appreciation, and still do, for classical philosophy, it didn't seem like something that I could reconcile with a bunch of other difficulties that I had in terms of like harmonization and evolution and the nature of religion, the nature of desire. I was always hung up and stuck on, in philosophy you're trying to come up with this rational interpretation of the world and use evidence and arguments in order to try to tease things apart and to understand things better. And I was always astonished at how unpersuasive reason was in terms of moving people. So you could give them really good arguments, you could give them tons of evidence, and it wouldn't actually shake or do anything for their foundational beliefs. So I figured that there was something going on in terms of reason and philosophy, or reason and psychology, that seemed really interesting to me at the time. And so then I was doing my master's in philosophy as well. And I had become kind of jaded and disenchanted with where philosophy was. I landed in a kind of Wittgensteinian postmodernism, still had a lot of attachment and affection for the classical philosophy, but was really kind of skeptical that philosophy was really going to provide the answers or do very much. And then, out of nowhere, actually off of watching a review for the movie Apocalypto, I was in need of a thesis topic to write about for my master's thesis. And the review talked about this philosopher, Rene Girard, and it was all about religion and sacrifice and evolution and harmonization and desire and all of these things that right at the time I was genuinely interested in.
Yeah.
And, for some people, it seems like it takes them a long time to digest. And I think that's fine. Girard is a difficult thinker. He's taking on so much intellectually. So I
Yeah.
understand like how it would take a lot of people some time to work through his ideas. Um, but for me, I read through Things Hidden like right away, and it was like this key that, I mean, as Gerard puts it in Deceit, Desire in the novel, the key just went into the lock, it turned, and like everything opened in terms of the exact, I mean, it was very fortuitous that it was the exact kind of questions and issues that I was struggling with and trying to work through and think through the time that seemed all totally answered by what Gerard had to offer. So like I was hooked.
Mm.
I knew, and the scale and scope of what Gerard was showing, and what his arguments were, the intellectual terrain that they were claiming, meant that if he was right, that like really his work inaugurates what can only be described as a new intellectual epoch. Like it's like, you know, like if we were to draw the line out for modernity, maybe it's like, you know, Newton and Darwin, and then maybe Freud or Einstein or something like that. But then it's like Gerard after that, and Gerard gives us like this whole, he's that big and that important, and if he's right, he gives us that kind of new starting point to really begin to think things through. And so I decided, you know, right then and there that, yep, this, I mean, in terms of ideas, he's going to be with me for the rest of my life for sure. And so I was going to spend, you know, wherever I ended up working in the intellectual space, I would end up working with his ideas. So
Wow.
that's a bit of it anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting that you say that, because I kind of went down the same path. I was, really interested in anthropology. Went to school to study history. And just really got into the whole idea of ritual and prohibitions and taboos.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Was reading a lot of trying to digest a lot of these French theorists.
Yeah, that could be difficult for sure.
Yeah, didn't understand really much any of that. It was just kind of like, is it because this is too French? Is it because of the language? You know what I mean?
Yep.
Is there sort of a marker that sort of regular people can't get into this sort of discourse because the language is not there to really
Mm-hmm.
explain what they're talking about. So, you know, after 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 realizing Gerard was sort of amongst that French wave group, not
Mm-hmm.
really, not really one of the not really, I guess, wanting to be one of the members within that group,
Mm-hmm.
but he kind of just became one of those, you know what I mean? But
Mm-hmm.
his work was very different in the sense from a intellectual level. I could read his Violence and the Sacred, and it just made a lot of sense to me, I guess, because I was thinking a bit about
Yeah. Yeah.
anthropology,
Yeah.
human sacrifice, the human sacrifice and scapegoat mechanism and stuff. But yeah, that's interesting how like everyone sort of stumbles on Gerard in a different way, but they all start to kind of understand what he's talking about. Well, for me, like you talked about, some people have to digest that slowly.
Yeah. I think it takes some people quite a time. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but I wanted to kind of go into, you talked about, majoring in philosophy, really, delving into that. And, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but, Girard didn't really like to categorize his ideas like within the philosophical category.
No, he has very negative just things to say about philosophy for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you say to that in terms of like how that works? Like I know, there's a lot of people who major in philosophy and stuff like that, and literary criticism, who like to read Girard and stuff like that. But um, I wonder, is there something sort of complicated about philosophy that, what do you think he didn't really care for, as far as it being a.
Sure. I mean, there's so much there. There's at least like a book on Girard and philosophy that needs to be written. Um,
Yeah.
so in the first place, Girard has this kind of argument about philosophy, right? He thinks that one thing that the scapegoat mechanism is doing, and one thing that desire is doing, is coming up with all of these kind of intellectual substitutes for its own violence, essentially, right? So what philosophy amounts to for Girard, is this cover up of our own violence. It's a distraction in a way of kind of like intellectualizing away our violence and moving it into all of these different kind of categories. That is a very strong argument. And it's difficult for Girard to even advance that argument because he has to square up or at least integrate his own theological position with the rest of that, right? So he has to say something like, well, human beings are reasonable and capable of reason because there's this actual mode of theological participation in life that is real and true, and that we can really live within. And at the same time, he wants to say everything else that has gone under the banner of philosophy, from Plato to Spinoza to Derrida, is this intellectual substitute for our own violence and our own aggression. Essentially, it's like, I think one way you could formulate it anyway. Yeah. And so he's very skeptical of take a philosopher like Hegel, for instance. He comes up with this huge system and the philosophy of history and the meaning of the unfolding of the cosmos and all of this. And for Girard, what Hegel has done is merely disguise the victimage process that goes into the real constitution of all of the processes and history that he's describing. So what I think personally, if I have to give my own riff on it, is like, I think Girard's argument is correct in that our intellectual life really does substitute away from and distract away from this basic process of victimage that we don't want to look at, that we don't want to see ourselves as being so fundamentally driven by in terms of mimetic rivalry. But at the same time, that his own work is, I would call it philosophical, right? It's not quite theology, although he's doing theology in some places, but it's an anthropology, and so it's philosophical anthropology, and it exists at that intellectual layer rate. Like, if you wanted to stack them up, maybe it's not the best way to think about it, but if you put theology on top, and then humanity is here, it's that kind of bridge between theology and anthropology, philosophy, and the rest of the human sciences. So I think he wanted to say, yeah, I think he would. I think he would be. I think that he wanted to resist getting lumped in with exactly that kind of French intellectual movement that was going on. He didn't want to be associated with deconstruction, which was what philosophy was. If you were a philosophe, you were like, with Derrida and Lacan and all of that. I think he wanted to very much resist being associated with that. I think he accepted as well, though. Similarly, the postmodern critiques of modernism. So like that kind of philosophy wasn't even worth talking about because it was already deconstructed and already defeated intellectually. And I think he said postmodernism isn't like, there's nothing in postmodernism that offers any solutions or any answers. And there's this real thing that people like from, Hegel, Spinoza, Plato, Aristotle, maybe Plato's interesting. We could maybe come back and talk about Plato a little bit, but okay. It seems like none of these philosophers really did detect the victimage mechanism that goes into the constitution of human culture, that goes into our psychology. And if that's the case, if philosophy really failed to detect it, then what is the relationship of reason to mimetic rivalry and desire and everything? So yeah, a lot there, and a lot to think about and a lot to discuss for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you think about philosophy sort of being like the capstone of academia. When you go into majoring something, if you get a PhD or something like that, it's a philosophical doctorate, right? And so you're like you've reached the highest peak once you've come to some philosophical understanding, or something like that. But I want to get to this thing, you talked about Plato and Aristotle, and so I'm thinking here, and you have to correct me if I'm wrong.
No worries. Just
Now Aristotle was a pupil or a student of Socrates, or
Plato? So Socrates, Plato, Aristotle is the kind of the genealogy. So Socrates, I mean, some modern people are like postmodern. Some recent scholars are like, maybe Socrates didn't even exist and he's just this character. That I don't think that's true. But Socrates, and then Plato is the student of Socrates, and then Aristotle is the student of Plato. So yeah.
Okay. Right. And so the story of Socrates is interesting because when you talk about, philosophy having this ability to sort of shield the truth, same way that, I guess, the mythological stories that you would find in,
exactly.
Right. Yeah. So are you essentially saying that he would have thought of philosophy as just another myth making sort of process, like he talks about when you talk about the pharmakon, right?
Yeah.
Derrida
Yeah.
talks about the pharmakon, and so maybe you could help me through that. What
No,
is the
you got it.
pharmakon?
You've distilled it and summarized it exactly. For Girard, he thinks that philosophy is functioning like a myth. That's exactly what
Yeah.
it does. So our whole intellectual life is this mythological structure that we can keep as this safe casing around what is the hard core of our of merely a victimage process that is being obscured or denied or intellectualized away. Yeah, that's exactly what he believes. I think it's a little bit different though, because mythology, I mean, this is like just speculating on it itself. Like mythology is directly related to the sacrifice, right? It's myth and mythological theology that is still tied up with with religion, and is painting a picture around what it is that's taking place, other than, well, it's just a community coming together violently against a victim and not understanding that and thinking it's a god and da 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 da. Whereas in philosophy, it's less about participating within that, but instead it's like a shifting of attention away towards intellectual life and mind and reason. So I guess it functions a little bit differently, but both of them have in common, yeah, they're covering up and distracting away from the victimage process.
Right. And so is it that philosophers, I mean, where does the violence play out in that? Is it sort of like, well, we're gonna have a sort of a boys only group or something like that, and we're kicking out everybody else because they're not smart enough,
I
you know?
mean, so that, yeah, I mean, like that's wonderful, and that's certainly one way in which philosophers, like even starting with Plato, right? He's like, well, no one else should have any rights or say or like any input or anything. It should just be philosophers who rule over everything. So there's that kind of violence of exclusion, and you can see that in Paris and the salons. But
Mhm,
Girard uses the example in Battling to the End of Hegel. I
mhm.
don't know. I don't want to pick on Hegel too much or whatever, but for Hegel, all of the wars and all of the violence of human history is generating this end of history in Hegel. This is what he thinks. There's these movements for something, and there's a reaction against it, and out of that clash becomes this new thing. You could say it in ancient terms, like out of death comes life for Hegel, and so Girard says, look at this, look at what's going on here. This is an intellectual substitute for what is merely mimetic rivalry and violence, and thinking that this big religious utopia is being born out of it or something like that. So
Wow.
yeah, so that's a powerful criticism, and like
Yes, it is.
and it's weird, it's more strange where you're like dealing with, I don't know, like Locke or Berkeley or Hume, where you're like having a debate about epistemology, and it's like, how is this debate about epistemology really like covering up the violence that's going on? And like
Yeah.
maybe because, but to Girard's, like, if I wanted to defend Girard, I would say, like, look, what's motivating these people? Well, it's mimetic rivalry with each other. My ideas are better, and no, my ideas are better,
Mhm.
and like the ideas might be an object, they might be a real object. Girard is like more or less skeptical and critical, but
Mhm.
certainly the motor, the engine for that, for what's going on, is this mimetic rivalry and this desire for prestige between the philosophers. So
Yeah. Yeah. So with that, I mean, I don't know how much you know about the pharmakon, right? Do you, do,
in
do you know
Derrida,
that whole?
in
I don't.
Derrida, or like
Well,
in
just like yeah. I mean, I suppose in general. I mean, I didn't. I mean, with Derrida, like again, for me, I can't understand
Yeah,
any.
I'm not sure that's a you problem. I think that's a him problem, really, to be honest. I would say that if anyone comes to me and they go to like with like, I don't know, Derrida or Lacan, or Foucault's a little bit better,
Mhm.
or Hegel, God forbid, or Kant, or if they come to me and they're like, I don't understand this or what's going on, I'm like, it's not so much a you problem, it's more of a them problem. And
Right.
so
Is
yeah.
it just? I mean, so in Greek, pharmakon means like a medication that
Yeah.
that you take, right? And
Yeah.
it can also mean like poison,
It's both.
right?
It's sacred in the Girardian language. It's both cure and poison, and
Right.
so yeah. So it's
And
like we're serving at pharmacy and all medicine and all of that from, yeah.
right. And so how would that work in sort of a philosophical discourse, say between someone like Girard and Derrida and philosophy? Like,
Hmm.
so I'll try to explain what I mean, because this is my thoughts when I first heard about the pharmakon.
Sure.
And my thought is that maybe Gerard was trying to explain that the Greek philosophers didn't like the poets and the prophets
Mm-hmm.
because they were telling too much of the truth. You know,
Hmm.
they're the plays and the myths and and all of that. The religious, dynamic there didn't really fare well with the philosophers. Maybe they thought that they were competing with him. I'm not sure. I mean, does that
Oh,
make sense what I'm saying?
well, look, there's so much there, Shannon.
Yeah.
So, for instance, like one thing you could say from like a Christian Girard point of view is that Plato or Socrates, whatever we want, their criticism of the mythologists was that, look, these gods are horrible. They're evil. They're murderous. They're bloodthirsty.
Yeah.
The way that you appease them is through these blood rites. So actually, in that case, this is why I say Plato is more interesting than the rest of philosophy and philosophers, which is like kind of sad, because it would be like, okay, so like if Plato was like both the beginning of philosophy, he's also like the best philosopher, and like everything else since him was. So like there's like, I think it's Bertrand Russell who said that all philosophy is a footnote to Plato.
Mhm.
And it might turn out to be that Plato got some interesting things right in terms of what he saw, but it's kind of weird. And to Girard's point, we should be skeptical that like nothing after Plato was as good as so anyway. But
Mhm.
so Plato, so Socrates and Plato denounced the gods and the myth makers as giving something that was both morally repugnant and filled with violence. And so for that, I think you could say actually that kind of philosophy, like, so Socrates says, look, God is the good, and clearly the good has nothing to do with Zeus going around and raping all of these women, or Ares going and slaughtering all of these different people because of this envious revenge over Aphrodite or something like that. So they would criticize the myths as actually being morally repugnant and violent. And so for that, I think you could say that's a philosophical improvement. So there's that, and then the
Okay.
pharmakon was like, it was institutionalized as the scapegoat in Athens, who could be used whenever there was a crisis. So it's a standard kind of victimage thing that's going on there. I think
Okay.
also, the Girardian critique of philosophy, and it's so interesting that you point all this out, is that philosophy would be attempting to be a kind of pharmakon, in that it's giving this cure, right? Here's this intellectual worldview. Here's this story. And this is another important point I forgot to mention, is that all of these philosophers within modernity, and less so in postmodernity, but whether it's communism, Nietzsche, Freud, all of the modern philosophers and rationalism, all of them are attempting to come up with this worldview, this story about the Rousseau, the total nature of reality. But what are they leaving out for Girard? Well, they're leaving out this victimage process. And it's like, if this is how human culture comes together, you can't have a total view of the world without at least, talking about this or noticing this or realizing this. So, okay. So I kind of went off in 5 different directions.
No,
I don't know if that's a good
okay.
answer to your question, but
No, yes.
we'll leave it there for, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that leads me, I guess, to my next thought here, and that's the whole idea of Athens versus Jerusalem. Right.
Hmm.
So I say, like, I mean, I'm just, I don't know how long this debate has been going on. I think there was one of the patristic fathers said, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem or something like
Yeah,
that?
that's right. I think it's Saint Irenaeus. And yeah, I mean, the real question came up like right away, is because there was debates with all of the philosophers about Christianity, and there was attempts. I mean, from Saint Paul at in the Agora or the Acropolis, having his debates. The question was like, look, we have divine revelation, we have the supreme model in the person of Jesus Christ himself. We have the scriptures in terms of the revelation of God. What do we need with philosophy? And the rejoinder from the church, I would say, collectively came to the decision that, like, look, God, if reason comes from anywhere, it comes from God. God is rational. Truth can't contradict truth. So whatever we can find that's good or true or beautiful within philosophy must harmonize with revelation as well. And so those can go together. However, Girard would come in and say, well, this was the beginning of where the problem started, because now now you're going to have over 1,000 years of Christian history, including 30 years of some of the most bloody violence that's ever taken place in terms of the European wars of religion, all in the name of Christ, and all like totally ignorant of this victimage process, which is precisely what the Bible from the beginning of Cain and Abel is attempting to reveal and show in terms of God. So, maybe, I mean, Gerard would say, I think he says in Things Hidden, like the closer you move to Athens, the further away you move from the revelation of Jerusalem, and the further away Christianity moves from its own superior, what it has to offer, which is superior to all philosophy, which is this revelation. But
it's,
yeah, I mean, so one of the things that's interesting is like Gerard leans so hard on the exclusivity of the scriptures compared to everything else. And he's got a strong point there, right? Like you don't find this kind of revelation much elsewhere, wherever you look, philosophy or other religious traditions. And you definitely do find it not just like once in the Bible, but all the way through and culminating in the Messiah, God himself, right? Within Jesus in the New Testament. But when we go and look at like the trial of Socrates, well, here you have a man who's being persecuted by an angry city, and all that he's done is go around and ask them a bunch of annoying questions. He goes and asks like the high priest, "So who is God and what is good, and like what is goodness and what pleases God?" Or he goes and asks like the judge of the city, like, "Well, what is justice and like how do you and no one can give him an answer to these questions, and so he's annoying. Like he's
right. Here comes this mother ever.
Exactly, right? And like and he's like and he he's got an answer for whatever is along, and he and eventually he pisses off so many powerful people that they conspire to have him killed, right? And in the Republic, Plato says, look, if there was a perfectly just man who came along, he would necessarily be as a victim of mob violence, because he would show to everyone else how unjust they are, and because they're unjust, they would become angry and they would kill the just man. So that kind of intuition that is in Plato, I don't think we can just like easily dismiss and say like, look, there's nothing of that. First of all, you can't say it's against divine revelation, right? Because it's clearly God. It's saying that the supreme God is good, that all the gods of the city are fake gods, that they're idols, they're false gods. Is saying that the virtuous life is striving after the good above everything else. All of that seems really, really in harmony with the Bible. And Nietzsche even thought that Plato actually, when he was in Egypt, was hanging out with there was a big Jewish intellectual group that was in Alexandria when Plato would have been there, and he thinks that Plato basically picked up his philosophy from the Jewish scriptures, and so that's Nietzsche's theory. We don't know if that's true or not, but one of the things that is interesting is if Plato really was working these things through and seeing what the true God, the true good is really all about. It's interesting that he takes the side of the victims. It's interesting that he denounces the gods of violence. It's interesting that he sees participation in the good as the highest moral life above everything else. And that if that's not God, then like whatever, it's like there's nothing. So I think that there's more to say, especially with Plato. And Plato's interesting as this kind of bridge figure between mythology and reason and Christianity. And so I think that there's much more to bring in with Plato than Gerard's total easy dismissal. And while it doesn't rise to the level of biblical revelation in terms of its clarity, its consistency, the depth of profundity, I mean, it reads much more like an intellectualized discourse. So it doesn't integrate like the poetic and everything. Although actually, I shouldn't even say that, because some of Plato's dialogues really do integrate the poetic in a really wonderful way. But that, look, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Well, Jesus and Socrates, they're both victims of the same collective violence. They're both being portrayed. Philosophy can point to this and can talk about this. And if that's where the start of our real intellectual life and real religious life opens up, if this is the plank that Jesus says needs to be removed from our eye before we can see correctly and correct anyone else, then there can't be any conflict. And so we can say, yeah, of course, the Athens can have plenty to do with Jerusalem. It just, but they all need to participate in the same revelation of the good or something like that.
Right. And so Socrates was was poisoned, right, and he was killed. And I remember, I remember listening to a talk given by Peter Thiel, and he talked
Hmm.
about how you know, he was talking about how sort of Socrates' disciples were around him. You
Yeah.
know, it was, but they all, but really, like what's underneath that, or like what's hidden, is actually like ran away.
Yeah.
They
Well, yeah, that's
fled.
right. So well, it's actually, so Peter's actually drawing from what Girard's response was. I think it's in When These Things Begin.
Mhm.
Um, and he said, like, Plato says, like, oh, he was sick that day, so he couldn't make it.
Yeah,
uh, and but he writes the dialogue anyway, right, and he tells
yeah,
the story. Well, like, rather than seeing that as a negative thing,
yeah,
how much closer to that is it to Saint Peter and Christ, where Peter denies Christ 3 times, and so this is Plato's admission that he didn't have the courage to stand up to the mob, and he was worried about being persecuted when Socrates was being persecuted. Now, what is genuinely different is that in the Apology, Plato is surrounded by the rest of his disciples, and he does get into these long it's the Phaedo, and they discourse about the immortality of the soul. Did that happen? Is that the way that it played out? And look, I mean, like, we can't say that it has the full revelatory package in the same way that you would find within the Bible, because
mhm,
Socrates still affirms the city of man, right? He still affirms, like, in the Republic, he's trying to build the perfect city. This perfect city is still within a world of violence. It doesn't have a solution to mimetic rivalry in the same way that Jesus does. But compared to everything else, it's pretty freaking good. And what the ancient fathers would have said is that, like, they saw Greek philosophy especially as this preparation for the Bible, the preparation for the fullness of Revelation. And I think that really the best reading of this stuff, and this is my own take on it, so take it, or take it for what it's worth, but my own take is totally within that patristic tradition, which sees what Plato was doing in classical philosophy as this preparation for the gospel, as preparation for the Bible, and that both of them together actually lead to the same endpoint. I think, anyway. That's
yeah, yeah. I mean, so what do you think? Sort of knowing that Revelation and the Gospels, and the biblical text are sort of the you know especially from a Christian standpoint, is the foundation of sort of our building blocks for civilization, right? The
Yeah, for sure.
cornerstone that the builders rejected,
Yeah, yeah.
I am the true vine. You know what I mean? All of these things, right? What do you think the sort of I guess repulsion or great dislike in the way
Uh,
within academia, and just even
uh,
like our cultural discourse? Why is it that like Greek philosophy,
yeah, that's
academically,
fine. That's fine. Everybody
yeah,
loves
like
that.
everybody
Yeah,
loves that, right? I mean,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
or like when you're in high school, you got to write a report on, like, you know, the Odyssey and Odysseus and the Trojan, and all
That's
of that.
fine. That's cool. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Right, right.
yeah.
But you can't, if as soon as you start talking about biblical text or revelation or anything,
Yeah.
they're like, that's too much, man. You don't
No,
got
no,
to
it smells bad. Yeah, yeah, 100%. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that Girard would say anyway is that what we have in terms of historical Christianity, that is the Christian churches and everything, is a God who's still way too violent. So the image that a lot of the churches put forward of a very judgmental and violent God is one that can't be squared with what the effects of the gospel have already done into creating the space for modern intellectuals to dismiss Christianity as too violent to be taken. Maybe that's one thing that's going on, and there might be something really to that critique. There are some versions of Christianity and Christian theology that do seem too violent to be taken seriously, in the light of the effects of the gospel, and in the light of what if God is love, then certain things really do have to follow from his essence, or else we have no idea what love is, right? Either God's love is so different from our whatever we think of loving is that we can't understand it at all, or if it's something like our love, then it has to be what we know as love, but then infinitely greater than that, and then like certain things have to follow from that. Like I don't think you can rationally maintain a God who would create people only to damn them to eternal conscious torment or something like that. Like, I don't think you can seriously maintain that. But a lot of Christians, they say, depending on what Christian background we're talking about, some of them are so low resolution that they're like, well, if you don't say this magic formula, God's going to roast you and torture you consciously for all eternity. And it's a good thing that He created you, and also He's loving and He cares about you. Like, all of that's somehow true all at the same time. Yeah. That seems ridiculous. And I think, like, for modern intellectuals, there's also some historical stumbling blocks in terms of like the evidence. But I think Gerard would also be really quick to point out, look, faith for a long time, like Kierkegaard said, a lot of like the Christian faith of his time, he railed against Christianity in his day in Denmark, because he said, like, look, everyone goes to church, but no one really believes, right? So you can have a faith that is totally mimetic, and you can have an anti-faith that is totally mimetic. They're both just totally mimetic. The intellectuals all hate Christianity because all the other intellectuals do, and as soon as it became fashionable, they would all jump on the same train. And to that point, among the postmodern French intellectuals, and I'm not sure if Girard had an effect here, that would be interesting to kind of look at, but there's other friends, there's like Alain Badiou, and others who talk about, like, they'll use like St. Peter and St. Paul, they'll sprinkle in a little St. Peter and St. Paul in their discourses, or they'll use a little bit from the Bible, not because they think it's true, but they'll just, to be fashionable, they'll just kind of throw it in there, and use these kind of images and examples and riffs to talk about. So as soon as it becomes fashionable, like a whole bunch of intellectuals go. But as it stands right now, I think that, there's this kind of violence and judgmentalism which turns them off and makes it seem like it can't be taken seriously. There's all of the ordinary people who are Christian who they don't want to be associated with or be entangled with or at all. And there's fashion dynamics and intellectual dynamics. I think those are some of the big ones anyway.
So what would you say to what do you think he would say as far as, the Jewish tradition of rabbinical practice, and I guess what I'm trying to say is just Christianity in general recognizes the biblical revelation in the Old Testament, right? But it doesn't totally get it right, like it doesn't, it's not, it hasn't been totally revealed, you know what I mean? Like, so it's like you could make the same case that's being made for like what's sort of off about philosophy could also be, and you could say the same thing.
That's really brilliant, Shannon. Yeah. That's
you know what I mean?
That's really wonderful. That's really brilliant. Yeah, I think you're right. And what a wonderful way to put it. It is interesting because mentioned Peter Thiel. He talked about this in a really nice way in terms of Marcion, right? As the first heresy. It's like, you can't lean in and become and into the New Testament and say the New Testament is the only good God, and like everything that went prior, that God's evil or something like that, right? And at the same time, you can't deny the superiority of the revelation that's contained within the New Testament. So it's like it has to be both in some way. For me, this is less of, and this is my own perspective on it. So I'm not sure it'll be the same for anyone else, but for me, when I see, even in the first story of Adam and Eve, but then especially with Cain and Abel, and then Joseph, and then Moses. I mean, God's quite a bit more violent in Exodus, and then in the books of the law. But in the Psalms, right, where 2/3 of the Psalms are written from the point of view of this victim who's being persecuted as a victim of collective violence and appealing to God to save them. For me, when it's right at the very beginning and it's this consistent thread of God being on the side of the victims all the way through, I don't see like the kind of rupture so much. Like I do see these areas where it's like, okay, clearly there's a bit of human violent imagining going into this that's going on in terms of the construction of this story or that story, or even if we wanted to be like really strong in terms of the content of the scriptures and say this is what God really actually did. Well, then this is what God actually did when we were this immature. It would be like the Girard way of. And I'm
Yeah.
not sure you can harmonize that totally intellectually,
Yeah.
but
No, that's yeah.
that's a way that it kind of works, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's
the prophets and even the later rabbinic scholars looked at the law as
yeah.
this temporary thing for an immature humanity to relate to God, because later Judaism, like post-temple Judaism, it said
Yeah.
like, look, the temple was this temporary thing where we were so immature in our relating to God that we couldn't have a spiritual relationship with God, so we still needed all of these extra things. And the prophets criticize this and say, look, all you have to do is love each other, and like every all the chaos and the violence. You don't need to like sacrifice 100 oxen or whatever. You just need
Yeah.
to love one another.
Right.
So it's all there, and Marcion can try to say that can try to scapegoat the God of the Old Testament, but like to me, and I get it. There's scenes in the Old Testament that are like horrifyingly violent, and if you just leaned into those because you wanted to use that to justify violence, okay, fine. But if you do what Christians have always done, which is read all of the scriptures through Christ, then you just like you get what seems impossible, which is this consistent truth maintained for however long you like, thousands of years, oral and written tradition, the same message, the same God, and all these different vivid portraits all the way through. Yeah, so it's like,
Yeah. I mean, that's a very, I never thought about it like a well, they were like, it's a display of immaturity. You know what I mean? Like they're young, and
yeah,
they have to be weaned like a child,
that's
like
right. Yeah, yeah,
you know,
yeah,
like the Bible talks about Jacob. I think it says something like, or one of the prophets is one of the fathers, he says, you know, he's like God looks at him like the apple of his eye, like a child.
yeah, yeah,
That
yeah,
he has to
yeah,
play with him or something, And
yeah,
so that makes a lot of sense. I mean, even when you think about, I think about Adam and Eve, in the garden, right?
yeah,
God says, "Don't eat this fruit, or lest you shall surely die." Well, this has sort of been a debate. I wouldn't say a debate, but a conversation amongst some other friends, mutual friends of ours, and stuff like that,
sure,
who tried to maybe see it in a way that, well, perhaps our father Adam and Eve were not prepared to eat of the fruit. They
hmm,
weren't. They were still like children, and they
yeah, yeah.
couldn't. They couldn't really maybe download. I'm not trying to use technical.
No, no, that's totally fine. Um,
you know,
and yeah, well, I think that there's like, it depends how like there's so many different ways that you could kind of like begin to offer an explanation for what's going. So one of the things is like, well, clearly there's a really profound lesson about our own desire in that story, because as soon as we take on as soon as we eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, what happens is that we start judging good and evil according to our own sight, and then immediately we're thrust into competition and rivalry with each other, right? The blame game starts playing right away. As soon as it happens, we're guilty, and the snake's to blame, Adam's to blame, Eve's to blame. It's like so like there's a profound lesson there about our shame and our guilt and how that runs our relationship with God and with each other. And like that's human beings. Like, and that somehow that's in the scriptures right there in the very first story, right? So that's really interesting. So there's that. But then also, if we wanted to think about it in terms of this story of God raising up the human race out of Adam, it's like, well, if it's a story, then it can't just be Adam and Eve. There needs to be like this fall, and like they can get a redemption and a resurrection. It's like there's a narrative explanation you could maybe give. That to me would be a little bit weaker, but it would work as a part of the story anyway. So it depends, like what you're reading of that of the first chapters of Genesis is. Is it like really literal? Is it more metaphorical anyway? I think whatever way you wanted to read it, you could come up with things that seem to be, after Girard's insight, really powerful in terms of understanding who human beings are, which is what to be from Adam means. Right? Adam is the first man. We're Adam. Christ comes and redeems Adam and saves Adam. So yeah.
So just lastly, I want to pick up on two things. First is the violence, right? We
Yeah.
talk about violence and how that's sort of, you know, I don't, if you want to say it's built into man after the fall, you know, or something like that. So what would the whole idea of violence being just in some ways, you know, like self-defense or something like that.
Sure. Yeah.
When you
Yeah.
talk about
Yeah.
Saint Augustine and just war theory, and
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, because people will say, well, you know, was Girard a pacifist? Was he?
Oh yeah. No, he wasn't. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, should you defend? You know, should
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
when people, you know,
Yeah. I think so. I think so. It's like, so Girard has like, he is like battling to the end is almost like a whole book of him trying to answer that one single question. Almost is like one. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in that book, but that's one thing you could say about what he's trying to do in that entire text. And you know, he's so like, what does Christ say? Christ says, give up all your mimetic rivalry. Like don't get thrust into erotic competition by lusting after this woman or that man or this man. Don't get into monetary competition. Give all your money away to the poor. Don't end up becoming a prostitute for the rich, or don't end up becoming a tax collector against the poor. Give up all of that. Give up your violence. Give it all. Okay. Christ tells us to do that. We're both Christians. I don't have much money, but I have I do have a wallet with some money in it. And you got some. I instead of turning the other cheek, I sometimes tell people to F off, and I'm rude and do all of that. I still lust after women. You know, I'm guilty of that as well. So where are we then as Christians, right? And what Girard is going to say is that Christ is going to give us the full answer and the full reason why those things are harmful, because they thrust us into this hell with each other and all of our, it is the source of all of our problems in terms of our misapprehension of God and everything. But we're working this out historically. So it's like, yeah, it's true that we could say, everyone give away all of your money to the poor. And if we all did that simultaneously, it would work. But God also created us free. And so it's got to be up to this work of freedom in history to be able to realize this. And so we're working this out historically. And in a world where some people are going to be stupid and arbitrarily violent to others, you need other people to stop that violence or to stop it from happening. And so, there's a place, as St. Paul would say, there's a place for the sword. The emperor has a function. The emperor can become a tyrant, and then he's like no better than any other thug who's around. But no, there's a place for this restraining of violence in history, because we're bound up in history. We're not at the end of history yet. And one day all of this won't be needed anymore. And one day we won't have any of this competition, but we're working this out historically. And when you read history that way, you can see both like real progress and also the tragedy of how stupid human beings are and falling for the same stuff over and over and over again. So, so Girard is going to say, look, we're on the side of God's on the side of the victims. We're on the side of the victims. We're on the side of peace. We're on the side of justice, but we're working that out historically. And so sometimes things will have to be done forcefully in order to make it better within history. And that's the complicated work of discernment and both the difficulty and the responsibility for all of us Christians. Hey, I mean, look, if you have kids, or you're in charge of a household or something like that, it might be fine for you to give your life up if you're violently attacked. You could do that as a witness, but are you going to let anyone attack your kids or go after? No, of course not. You're going to stop that from happening. So so that, I think that's the kind of answer is that Girard wants to offer us anyway, which seems to me to make sense. Like, it seems to be a good answer, actually, even if it doesn't give us like perfect solutions that we're looking for, like, you know, an if then table of what it is that you can do or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. If somebody does this, then what should I do? Well, I'm gonna do this.
Well, it's like, well, that's what the law tries to do in the Old Testaments, right? Like, if you're
Yeah,
if your ox gores this other guy, then you got to pay an indemnity of like 300 talents to like him or whatever. That's probably way too
yeah,
much. Actually, 300 talents is a ton of money. Um,
yeah.
but that's what the law tries to do, right? Is to restrain violence through this kind of if then, like,
Right,
if you transgress this way, this will be the penalty and what it has
right.
to do. And that's better than like uncontrolled violence. That's
Yeah,
better than
yeah,
runaway escalation. But it also, Christ actually calls us to something even higher than that, which is to
yeah,
like work through love with one another. And that is like, you know, a lot more difficult, but also a lot more interesting too, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah. It's very interesting to think about and to contemplate. Right. It is much more difficult
to do, yeah.
do
Oh my
that.
god,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And you know, I'm the first to say I suck at it, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's not easy to do, yeah.
Yeah, they said what the soul is willing, but the flesh is weak.
See, that's right. Exactly. Exactly. And it's exactly true. Like, you know,
Yeah,
intellectually, it's fine. Oh yeah, I know. You need to love each other. Oh, that's so simple. That's so easy. Yeah, go try and do it for like a week and get back to me and see how it goes. Yeah. Uh-huh.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, great, bro. I want to thank you, man, for joining me. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, it's
I
such a
don't.
pleasure, brother.
Yeah, I'm not trying to. I don't want to burn you out too fast, man. I'm trying to have you
Okay.
back
Okay.
on the show, man.
Okay, great. No, this is great
Yeah.
fun, and you're wonderful to talk to. You can have me
Thank
back.
you.
You can have me back anytime, Shannon. This is a pleasure.
Thank you. I appreciate that, man. Well, okay. Till next time, brother. Thanks
All
for
right,
joining
man.
me.
God
Okay.
God bless and great conversation.
Same to you, brother. Thank you.
Okay.